Hi guys, just going to say a couple of things really about sharpening of swords and knives. I'm not going to go into great detail because this is something that I'm learning more about all the time, and I'm trying to get better at sharpening things. Over the last couple of years I think I have got better at sharpening swords, but something I've noticed both myself through my own experience but also reading sources, both modern and historical, that talk about this, is that there are different kinds of edge for different kinds of job. Now this is probably not news to most of you. Most of you will appreciate that there are different kinds of edge you might want to put on a knife. Obviously there's different angles of edge, but there's also a different sort of fineness of edge. If you look at any edge under a microscope or a strong magnifying glass, you'll see it's a series of teeth. And these teeth can point in different directions, and they can also be of different sizes. And it's really the different size teeth that I want to talk about. And something I've noticed is that getting a very fine edge on a sword, that is, where the teeth are very, very small, doesn't always produce a better cutting sword, depending on what you're trying to cut. And something I've noticed is that certain sword manufacturers put a sharp edge on their swords. An example of this is Angus trimmed swords, that is actually quite a rough, quite a toothy edge. And they cut very, very well on most targets, and they cut very well on hard targets specifically, actually. Better, I find, than the very fine edge. And I thought, you know, I'd kind of noticed this and thought this might just be my misunderstanding, or even just a modern sort of a modern thing that wasn't necessarily historical or had any basis in history. But then I started to think about how were knives and swords sharpened. So I started looking at medieval sources to begin with, and it has to be said at the beginning, there's very little data on sharpening swords, and I have looked a lot over a wide period of time, from the medieval period right the way through to the 19th century, end of the 19th century as well. And there seem to have been various different methods for sharpening knives and swords. Now clearly there's essentially two types of sharpening of swords and knives. There's the type of sharpening that you would do yourself to maintain an edge, or there's the type of sharpening that you would have done for you professionally. And clearly there are certain pieces of machinery, even in the medieval times, that are not available to you if you're on the move or travelling around. For example, a large whetstone or a grinding wheel. Now, something that I found interesting is that, contrary perhaps to some people's perceptions, in the medieval period they did have large grinding wheels, and these were hand cranked. And you can certainly see these in 14th century art. I think it's either the Romance of Alexander manuscript or the Luttrell Psalter. I can't remember which of those it is. You see a large wheel about that big, about the size of a millstone, with a trough at the bottom, so the trough goes through the water and keeps the stone watered, and another person assisting with a large hand crank. And in fact you can also see these that are powered by belts attached to a water mill, or perhaps in some cases a windmill, but the ones I've seen are water mill connected. So they're actually a water driven giant wheel that are used for polishing, and clearly polishing and sharpening are related sciences for the medieval period. So you've got these large grinding wheels, and clearly that's how a lot of the final shaping on sword blades and knives, and perhaps even polishing armour surfaces was done in the medieval period. And you can see pictures of people going with a sword blade along one of these wheels. Now it's possible that's just putting the initial edge on, rather than then finishing off by hand with a smaller whetstone, for example. We don't really know because there's not a lot of data. And looking through the centuries, actually the process doesn't seem to have changed very much. In the 19th century we've also got powered grinding wheels used for sharpening, as well as hand sharpening. Now clearly, if you're on the move and you're maintaining an edge or fixing an edge that's been damaged in combat, you're not going to probably be near a grinding wheel or a polishing wheel, so you need to do it by yourself. And that's where stones come into it. I personally use, it's the Falkniven DC4, which you can buy on Amazon and other places on the internet. It's a small stone like that, goes in a little leather pouch, and it's brilliant. I've used lots of whetstones over the years and other kinds of stones for sharpening knives and swords, and partly because those stones didn't suit me so much maybe, or partly because I've got a bit better, but I still find, even though I have more expensive and better whetstones, I still find I generally get the best results with one of these. And of course, the way that people are often recommended to sharpen a knife, if you look at any of the tutorials on YouTube for kitchen knives for example, is you fix the whetstone on the worktop or the table that you're working on, and you actually you do in one movement, you sort of slice into the stone with the knife. But of course with something as long as a sword, that's not really very practical. Number one, the stone isn't big enough, and number two, you can't really get it all in one drawer, keeping the angle correct and everything else. So I actually find it's better to do it in reverse with the sword, and that is to hold the sword. I normally do it by eye, but I know some people who fix it on a desk or fix it on a workbench. But I hold the sword and I use the smaller stone, and I move the stone and keep the tool or sword or weapon held by hand, fixed. So I kind of reverse the way that they tend to advise how you do it with a kitchen knife. But yeah, so historically, obviously you've got these big sort of turning stones, grinding wheels that we use for sharpening professionally. And then also you've got the small stones, and in some certain types of messer and peasant knife, that is sort of hunting sword, hunting knife, from the medieval and Renaissance periods, and in fact through to about the 18th century, you often find pockets in the side of the scabbard, and sometimes in those you actually find a little whetstone. And there is also a sharpening steel as well, which most of you will know from carving knife sets, and that's really, my understanding is that's really to, if you have a very fine edge and the fine edge curls a bit, what you're really doing with the steel is just realigning that curled over edge. That's my understanding of what the steel is for. The steel doesn't really sharpen so much as maintain the edge. To get a really good edge, you've got to use a whetstone or a stone of some kind. You've got to grind essentially. Incidentally, you can also achieve similar results with wet and dry sandpaper if you stick it or bind it onto something flat like a piece of wood. And lastly, I should also mention, in terms of how to sharpen, that a lot of modern people and a lot of the sword manufacturers, of course, put an edge on a sword with a belt grinder. And a belt grinder seems like a very modern piece of equipment, but actually if you think about it, it's really just a modern wheel. It's a modern grinding wheel. It's just that it happens to be done on a belt instead of on a circle. But actually it's kind of doing it historically with a modern tool. And of course it's easier because you can change the grades of paper you use without having to have a great big set of different stone wheels and so on. So the last thing I want to say is going back to the beginning about the different kinds of edge, and I found a nice reference in something I'm working on at the moment, which is one of Alfred Hutton's early works, where he actually talks about the type of edge that he thinks soldiers should put on their sabres and bayonets, and he specifically described the type of edge that I've seen on Angus trim swords and certain other modern manufacturers' swords, this quite toothy edge. And Hutton likens it to the teeth of a shark, and he essentially says that you should sharpen from the hilt to the point, that's going into the edge that way, such that you leave downwards angled teeth. They won't look like teeth to the naked eye necessarily, but if you feel, they won't feel like a smooth edge, they'll feel like a serrated edge. And he says that for two reasons. One, this cuts quite well. But also it's easy to apply and quick to fix. Okay, and that's quite important because you know, we've talked a lot about edge damage and damaging swords in use, and if you're going to maintain an edge, a sword edge in the field, or a halberd or an axe or any other kind of weapon edge in the field, you need to be able to do it relatively easily and quickly, and any soldier needs to be able to do it for themselves. And so Hutton advises a file, a fine steel file, and I have sharpened many things with files actually, and you don't get a very, very sharp edge, but you do get quite an effective edge that I've cut my finger on many times. And he advises every soldier to have a fine file in their kit bag, and they can maintain their own edges in this way. So there we go. I do recommend people experiment in test cutting with it as well, putting different kinds of edges on their swords and knives, and it is very, very interesting to see that sometimes the edge which is more quickly put on and perhaps a bit cruder, this slightly serrated edge, on some targets does seem to cut better. So there we go. Thank you.